For 3 decades, the heart of London carried a secret, a crime buried beneath the everyday hum of Baker Street, where red buses rolled past tourists clutching guidebooks, and the shadow of Sherlock Holmes loomed over souvenir shops. To the world, this was a place of safety, wit, and history. But beneath the facade, one night in 1992 left a scar that never fully healed. It wasn't the kind of story whispered in pubs or retold by guides leading visitors to 221B. It was darker, quieter, and infinitely more human. A young life was stolen, an investigation faltered, and the city moved on. Or so it seemed. Families mourned in silence. Investigators wrestled with unanswered questions, and Baker Street itself became a stage for absence. Now, after 30 years of doubt and shadows, an arrest has finally shattered that silence, and with it, a community's fragile peace. London, 1992. The city was alive with contradictions. The Cold War had ended, yet uncertainty lingered in the air. Streets buzzed with commuters in sharp suits, cassette tapes spilled from shop fronts, and neon signs lit the nights. Beneath the glamour of Oxford Street and the West End, however, Britain was wrestling with recession, unemployment, and a growing sense of unease. Baker Street, tucked between tradition and transformation, carried its own mythology. For tourists, it was the home of the great detective, a place where intellect always triumphed over crime and justice was inevitable. Souvenir shops sold pipes and deerstalkers, and children posed proudly outside 2121B as if Sherlock Holmes himself might step through the door. But just a short walk from that polished image, another story was quietly unfolding, one not of clever deductions, but of real violence and real loss. The neighborhood itself was a paradox. Families had lived in its brick flats for generations, building a close-knit community of shopkeepers, office workers, and laborers. At the same time, the area was a hub of anonymity, thousands passing through daily on the underground, strangers brushing shoulders and vanishing into the city's currents. It was this mix of familiarity and facelessness that made what happened next so chilling. When tragedy struck, it did not come with the theatrical flair of Holmes's fictional London, nor the tidy resolution of a detective's final reveal. Instead, it brought confusion, unanswered questions, and a void that stretched on for decades. The case that began on Baker Street in 1992 would defy logic, elude the brightest minds of Scotland Yard, and haunt a family long after the headlines faded. It was a reminder that sometimes, even in the heart of London, justice can be silenced. To understand the weight of what was lost, we must first step into the world of the victim, a life that in 1992 seemed ordinary, full of promise, and never destined to be remembered for tragedy. Her name was Anna Harris, a 26-year-old administrative assistant who worked for a small insurance office near Regent's Park. She was neither a celebrity nor a politician, but she was known in her community for her warmth, her easy laughter, and her unwavering loyalty to her family. To her younger brother, she was the steady presence who reminded him to keep his head down in school. To her parents, she was the first to move out, but the one who still phoned every Sunday without fail. Anna's days followed a comforting rhythm. She would leave her modest flat in Marylebone each morning, walking briskly with a scarf wrapped around her neck, coffee in hand, often stopping by the same corner cafe where the barista knew her order by heart. 1 strong tea, 2 sugars. Her colleagues described her as efficient but never cold, the kind of worker who brought in biscuits on Fridays and remembered everyone's birthdays. In the evenings, she would meet friends for drinks or return home to lose herself in books. Historical novels were her favorite. She dreamed quietly of travel, of someday seeing Italy, though money was always tight. Those who knew her best said Anna carried herself with a kind of grounded optimism, a belief that life, though imperfect, would steadily get better. She was saving bit by bit, talking about perhaps taking night classes, sketching plans for a future she hadn't fully defined but deeply believed in. Her ordinariness was her beauty. She was like so many others who pass through Baker Street each day, anonymous to strangers, beloved to a few. And it is precisely that ordinariness that makes her fate so haunting. Because when Anna didn't come home one night, it wasn't just a routine broken. It was an entire world torn apart. It was Friday, March 13th, 1992, the kind of evening that began like so many others in Anna Harris's life. The city was restless with weekend energy. Offices spilled workers into the streets, pubs filled with chatter, and the last of winter's chill clung to the air as people hurried to claim a table before the night grew late. Anna left work just after 6, exchanging her usual goodbyes with colleagues. One remembered her laughing as she pulled on her coat, saying she had earned a glass of wine tonight. She wasn't in a rush, but there was a lightness about her, the relief of a long week ending. She walked youth toward Baker Street, weaving through the throngs of commuters with the steady pace of someone who knew the route by heart. Her first stop was the King's Arms, a modest pub where she often met friends. That night, she shared a drink with 2 colleagues, raising her glass in casual toasts and chatting about office gossip. Witnesses later recalled nothing unusual. Anna was cheerful, composed, and left around 8:15, saying she had plans to stop by a bookstore before heading home. She was next seen in Hatchard's, the bookseller just off Piccadilly, where she browsed historical novels. The clerk who rang her up remembered her politeness, her soft thank you, as she tucked the book into her bag. By 9 o'clock, she was back on Baker Street, waiting at the bus stop near the underground station. A CCTV camera, grainy, black and white, caught her standing alone, glancing at her watch. What happened next has been reconstructed only in fragments. A man smoking nearby appeared to speak to her briefly. Police would later struggle to identify him. Another witness, a taxi driver, swore he saw her walking north, book tucked under her arm, heading toward the dimly lit stretch near Dorset Street. She seemed calm, unhurried, unaware that she was stepping into a chapter of her life no one could close. At 9:27, Anna made her final known phone call from a red telephone booth near Baker Street Station. She rang her flatmate, leaving a casual message on the answering machine. "Running a bit late, don't wait up." Her voice, preserved on tape, carried no sign of fear. It was the sound of routine, of life still intact. And then, silence. Somewhere between that phone booth and the short walk back toward her flat, Anna Harris vanished. No one saw her board a bus. No one recalled her on the underground. The man with the cigarette melted into anonymity. The city swallowed her whole. Later, investigators would obsess over those final steps. Was she followed from the bookstore? Did she know the man who spoke to her? Was she lured, or was it sudden? A moment's violence carried out in the space of seconds. The details, mundane at the time, became sinister in hindsight. The tilt of her head on the CCTV, the cigarette glow beside her, the faint static of her last recorded words. For Anna's family, the night was a void. When she didn't arrive home, they assumed delays, a missed bus, a late night with friends. But as hours stretched into morning, that void became an abyss, one that would consume not only Anna's life, but the peace of everyone who loved her. The night ended without witnesses, without evidence, without explanation. A book still in her bag, a voice frozen on tape, and then nothing. It was as though the lights of London dimmed for a single moment, and when they flickered back, Anna Harris was gone. The morning after the disappearance, the city went about its business as usual. Rush hour on Baker Street bustled with hurried commuters, red buses, and the constant chatter of shop fronts. Yet inside one quiet flat, silence had settled like a heavy curtain. The victim's absence was no longer an inconvenience. It was a wound opening wider with every unanswered ring of the phone. At first, the family clung to rational explanations. Maybe they'd stayed over at a friend's place. Maybe they'd missed the last train and chosen the safer option of a night in a hotel. London could be unpredictable like that, but by late morning, worry sharpened into alarm. Calls to friends yielded nothing. Nobody had seen them since the night before. By midday, relatives retraced their steps. They walked the same pavements the victim had walked, ducked into the same cafes and pubs, asking if anyone remembered a familiar face. Some staff recalled vague glimpses. Yes, I think I saw them. Wasn't it around closing time? But no one could say for sure. Then came the call to the police. It was met, as too many calls were in those days, with bureaucratic restraint. Officers reminded the family that adults sometimes vanished by choice. They suggested waiting 24 to 48 hours before escalating. To the loved ones, it felt like a dismissal, as though the missing person's fear and vulnerability were invisible. That night stretched unbearably long. The family gathered in the living room, eyes fixed on the clock, ears straining for the sound of a key in the door. Every passing hour deepened the dread, until denial gave way to a grim acknowledgement. Something terrible had happened. The victim was no longer just missing. They had been swallowed by the city's shadows. When the case officially crossed into the hands of the Metropolitan Police, the family expected swift action, the kind of efficiency London's mythologized detectives were famous for. Baker Street, after all, carried a name synonymous with solving mysteries. Yet the reality, as they would soon learn, was tangled in something far less heroic: bureaucracy, red tape, and a sluggishness that would cost them dearly. Detectives did what procedure demanded. They interviewed immediate family members, colleagues, and friends. They mapped out the last known movements: a drink at a pub near Marylebone, a walk back toward the underground, a possible sighting near a late-night newsstand. The trail was thin, but not invisible. It was a puzzle that still had its pieces. But those pieces were scattered, and no one seemed to be picking them up quickly enough. CCTV footage from the underground could have been vital. Cameras dotted the platforms, stairwells, and station entrances. But in 1992, the system was far from centralized. Each line, each station, had its own protocols. By the time requests were processed and forms passed through hands, crucial tapes had already been overwritten. Hours of evidence, perhaps showing the victim's last known steps, were gone forever. Witnesses, too, slipped through the cracks. A shopkeeper who thought they saw someone matching the victim's description loitering near Baker Street was interviewed weeks later when memories had already blurred. A cab driver, certain he'd picked them up near Regent's Park, was never properly followed up on. Conflicting accounts piled up, and instead of clarifying the timeline, the statements only muddied it. For the family, every day without answers felt like a betrayal. They visited the station daily, often met with polite but perfunctory updates. "We're following leads. These things take time." To them, time was the enemy. To the institution, time was just paperwork. Resources were stretched thin, detectives reminded them. London in the early 90s was no stranger to crime: murders, robberies, disappearances. They all competed for attention. Unless a body was found or foul play was undeniable, a missing adult was rarely prioritized. Frustration grew. The family placed posters around the city, handed out leaflets, and even pooled money for private searches. They did the legwork the police should have been doing. Every unanswered call, every formality delayed, chipped away at their trust. By the end of the first month, the case hadn't stalled. It had nearly ground to a halt. What began as a disappearance was quietly reclassified as a missing persons inquiry, a softer label that seemed to strip urgency from the investigation. Behind closed doors, whispers circulated. Had the victim left voluntarily? Could they have been hiding secrets? Such speculation allowed the authorities to rationalize their inaction, to transform a tragedy into an administrative inconvenience. But for the family, there was no rationalization, only the unshakable knowledge that someone they loved was out there, silenced. And with every passing week, the sense of helplessness deepened. The city, with all its grandeur and history, had swallowed them whole, and the very institutions meant to protect seemed powerless or unwilling to fight back. With the investigation slowing, a different kind of inquiry took root, not in police files, but in whispers carried through Baker Street's cafes, pubs, and office corridors. Silence and uncertainty left a void, and in that void, rumors thrived. Some were quick to suggest the disappearance was random, the work of a violent mugger who struck in the wrong place at the wrong time. London in the early 90s had its share of street crime, and to some the explanation seemed both simple and terrifying. If it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. Others looked closer to home. Friends were scrutinized, partners eyed with suspicion, and colleagues whispered about hidden tensions in the victim's personal life. Was there a jealous lover, a falling out no one had known about? Even the most mundane disagreements were inflated into possible motives. What had once been private became public speculation, dissected over pints and tabloids. The media only fueled the fire. Local papers ran headlines that blurred the line between fact and conjecture, painting the victim alternately as a tragic innocent or someone with secrets yet to be revealed. Reporters knocked on doors, cornered relatives for comments, and pieced together sensational fragments into narratives designed to sell, not to clarify. Each article seemed to deepen the divide between truth and perception. Neighbors, too, found themselves caught in the undertow. Some rallied with compassion, helping the family distribute flyers. Others withdrew, uneasy with the idea of being associated with a household under scrutiny. In workplaces, hushed conversations erupted in break rooms. Did you hear what they say happened? Reputations shifted overnight, shaped not by evidence but by hearsay. The absence of answers was as corrosive as the crime itself. Fear turned inward, eroding trust. Every unfamiliar face on Baker Street became suspicious. Every familiar one carried the potential for betrayal. For the family, it was a second ordeal layered atop their grief. They weren't just losing someone they loved. They were watching their own lives become fodder for gossip and judgment. Their pain had become public property, reshaped and retold until even they struggled to separate what they knew from what others insisted was true. The longer the case remained unsolved, the more the narrative belonged not to facts, but to speculation. And in that swirl of suspicion, the truth only seemed to recede further into shadow. In the weeks that followed, Baker Street carried a strange duality. By day, the neighborhood moved in its familiar rhythm. Shopkeepers arranging displays, students hurrying to lectures, tourists pausing to snap photographs at the Sherlock Holmes Museum. But by night, grief and fear gathered like fog. Candlelit vigils sprang up at street corners, with handwritten notes taped to lampposts and faded photographs pinned to railings. The flames flickered in the cold air, fragile symbols of hope against a city that seemed indifferent. Neighbors who had rarely spoken before now stood shoulder to shoulder, clutching candles, reciting prayers, and sharing fragments of memory. I saw them walking past the bakery that morning. They always smiled when they passed the newsstand. The victim's absence became a shared wound, knitting the community together in a way that was both comforting and profoundly sad. Yet beneath that warmth, unease spread. In pubs along Marylebone Road, conversations grew sharp-edged. Some insisted the culprit had to be an outsider, a drifter, a stranger, someone who had slipped through unnoticed. Others whispered darker theories, pointing to familiar faces, a neighbor who kept odd hours, a coworker who seemed too quiet, even family members whose grief appeared either too restrained or too dramatic. Compassion turned brittle, splintering into suspicion. The media amplified both currents. Cameras lingered on vigils, turning private mourning into broadcast spectacle. But the same cameras also stalked residents, magnifying rumors and fueling paranoia. For every headline about unity, another hinted at scandal or betrayal. For those who lived on Baker Street, the effect was corrosive. Some found purpose in the search, forming volunteer patrols and helping distribute flyers across the city. Others drew their curtains tighter, convinced that danger lurked too close for comfort. Parents warned their children not to linger outside. Shopkeepers closed earlier. Conversations hushed when strangers walked in. The paradox was striking. The community was both more connected than ever and more fractured. Grief had united them in a vigil's glow, yet fear and rumor had turned neighbors into suspects. Violence had not only taken one life, it had seeped into the pavements, altering how people moved, spoke, and trusted one another. Baker Street, once a symbol of literary cleverness and urban charm, now felt like a stage haunted by absence. For those who lit candles and whispered prayers, the hope was that solidarity might keep despair at bay. But each vigil carried an unspoken dread. Until the truth surfaced, no one could be sure who to mourn, who to trust, or who might be watching from the shadows. Every promising thread seemed, in time, to unravel. The first break had come with urgency. A man detained after boasting in a pub about knowing what happened on Baker Street. For a few days, hope ran high. Detectives leaned on him. The press hinted at an imminent arrest, and the family braced themselves for answers. But the man's story collapsed under scrutiny. He had been drunk, seeking attention, nowhere near Baker Street that night. He walked free, leaving only bitterness behind. Then came the forensic tests. Fibers collected from a coat near Regent's Park initially suggested a link, until it emerged that samples had been improperly stored. Contamination rendered the evidence useless, another crucial chance squandered. Witness timelines, too, began to buckle. A supposed sighting at a bus stop turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. Another witness, certain they'd seen the victim entering a cab, later admitted they weren't sure of the date at all. Each correction chipped away at confidence, replacing clarity with fog. For the family, the cycle became unbearable, the swell of hope with every breakthrough, the crash of despair when it proved empty. Each disappointment etched deeper lines of exhaustion and grief into their faces. Even the wider community, once galvanized, began to falter. Flyers curled on lampposts, their colors fading in the rain. Volunteers stopped attending meetings. Conversations shifted from, "When will they find them?" to the quieter, more hopeless, "Will they ever?" Behind closed doors, frustration simmered. The family questioned whether the police had ever truly committed to solving the case. Neighbors muttered about incompetence, about resources wasted, about clues lost to negligence. False leads did more than delay justice. They eroded trust in institutions, in witnesses, even in the possibility of truth itself. Each dead end wasn't just a failure. It was a reminder of how fragile the search for justice could be and how easily it could slip beyond reach. By the end of that first year, the case file was thick with reports, interviews, and test results, but not with answers. What had begun with urgency now drifted toward silence, leaving only shadows where clarity was meant to be. Silence can be louder than any siren. After the frenzy of the first year, the press conferences, the searches, the neighborhood patrols, the case began to wither. By 1994, Baker Street bustled as it always had, tourists queuing outside the Sherlock Holmes Museum, office workers rushing past the underground. But for one family, every passing commuter was a reminder of the person who never came home. The police file grew dust. Detectives rotated out of the department. New officers inherited a thick binder of interviews and false leads, most too cold to revive. What had once been described as an active investigation was quietly reclassified as pending. The urgency of those early weeks evaporated, leaving the family to fight for scraps of attention. The 1990s gave way to the new millennium, and the city itself transformed. Baker Street became brighter, cleaner, more commercial. CCTV cameras spread across London in the wake of rising crime and terrorist threats. But for this case, those advancements came too late. The missed footage from 1992 could never be retrieved. Technology marched forward while the investigation stood still. Then came the volunteers. A local search and rescue group, newly equipped with sonar and diving technology, reached out to the family with an offer to sweep areas of the Regent's Canal and disused basements near Baker Street that had never been fully examined. It was a gesture of solidarity more than certainty, but it sent ripples through the family's despair. For the first time in years, people outside their circle cared again. Inside the forensic lab, old evidence was slowly unpacked. Sealed bags of clothing, fragments of material, even handwritten reports that seemed relics from another age. What had once been dismissed as inconclusive was now reanalyzed under machines capable of detecting what earlier technology had missed. The process was painstaking, each result delayed by weeks, sometimes months, but it was movement, and movement was more than the family had dared hope for. The media, too, began to stir. Small articles first. Cold Case Review, Baker Street Mystery reopened. Then larger outlets picked it up, fascinated by the juxtaposition of a real unsolved crime with the cultural mythology of Sherlock Holmes. Cameras returned to the street, tourists pausing at makeshift shrines, locals recalling the fear of 1992. The story that had once faded into silence began to hum again, carried by voices old and new. For the family, it was a trembling shift. They were no longer alone in their vigil. The city that had once abandoned them was beginning, however cautiously, to remember. But hope is a fragile thing. It can illuminate, but it can also cast long shadows. And in the case of Baker Street, that flicker of light would soon expose truths far darker than anyone had imagined. Breakthroughs in cold cases rarely come as lightning bolts. They creep in quietly, the product of persistence, of new tools applied to old puzzles. Yet when it came, the discovery in the Baker Street case landed like thunder. The re-examination began with something mundane, a sealed evidence bag, its label faded, retrieved from the bottom of a storage box. Inside was a blouse, the same blouse the victim had worn on the night of her disappearance. At the time, investigators had tested it for fibers, for stains, but the technology of 1992 could only go so far. The results had been inconclusive, another frustration filed away. Now, 3 decades later, the blouse was placed beneath the lens of modern forensic machinery. Under bright, sterile lights, technicians swabbed at seams and cuffs. Hours of work distilled into a few microscopic samples, traces invisible to the naked eye, yet potentially explosive in consequence. The results came back slowly, each data point crawling across the screen like hesitant revelations. At first, nothing. Then, a partial DNA profile, too degraded to mean much on its own. But the technicians pressed on, cross-referencing, amplifying, filling in the genetic gaps with the precision only modern science could offer. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to take shape. Finally, a match emerged. It wasn't random. It wasn't speculative. It was a direct hit on the national database. A man with a prior conviction, arrested years after the disappearance for an unrelated violent offense. His name had never surfaced in the original investigation. He wasn't a neighbor, a co-worker, or a family friend. To the family, the name meant nothing, but to detectives, it meant everything. The revelation shook the cold case unit. For years, theories had swirled around jealous lovers, opportunistic muggers, or even elaborate disappearances staged for unknown reasons. This man had slipped through every net, unnoticed and unexamined, and now, decades later, science had dragged him from the shadows. Still, DNA was only the first crack. Investigators needed more context, corroboration, proof that could stand in court. They revisited old files, looking for threads that might now weave together. That was when a forgotten witness statement resurfaced. A shopkeeper who, back in 1992, had mentioned a man loitering near Baker Street around the time of the disappearance. The statement had been buried, dismissed at the time as vague, not actionable, but the description, tall, wiry, with a scar along his jawline, aligned chillingly with the man whose DNA had just surfaced. The pieces began to fit. Detectives traced the man's movements in the early 1990s. Records showed he had worked sporadically in construction, including sites within walking distance of Baker Street. He had lived in a series of rented flats, each more transient than the last, and he had a history of violence that escalated in the years following the disappearance. The investigation accelerated with a kind of controlled frenzy. Interviews were reopened, relatives of the suspect questioned. Old associates described him as volatile, prone to sudden rage, and often vanishing for days. One former co-worker recalled a chilling comment he had made in the early 1990s. "London streets swallow people whole. No one even notices." At the time, it had sounded like bravado. Now it read like confession. Detectives brought their findings to the family before making it public. The name meant nothing to them. No connection, no familiarity. The shock lay not in recognition, but in its absence. The idea that a stranger, an anonymous face in the city crowd, had changed their lives forever was both horrifying and oddly relieving. For years they had wondered if someone they knew was responsible. Now they knew. The violence had come from outside. When the arrest finally came, it was swift. Officers surrounded a mode, St. Flat in East London, where the man had been living quietly. Neighbors described him as reclusive, keeping odd hours. He opened the door in his dressing gown, bewildered as armed officers stormed inside. For him, the past had caught up at last. For the family, the phone call from police was surreal. Words they had longed to hear for 30 years. "We have someone in custody," sounded almost impossible, like a dream colliding with reality. Tears came, not of relief, but of release, decades of bottled anguish spilling out in one unstoppable tide. The case that had been a ghost for so long was suddenly flesh and blood again. The mystery of Baker Street was no longer unsolved. It had a name, a face, and soon a reckoning. For decades, the Cleveland disappearance had gathered dust in the city's archives, its files boxed and shelved like relics of a forgotten tragedy. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. When the breakthrough evidence surfaced, the silence that had smothered the case gave way to chaos. Police departments scrambled, prosecutors convened urgent meetings, and journalists descended like birds, sensing a long-awaited feast. The old case files were pulled from storage, their folders yellowed and their staples rusted. Detectives, some barely old enough to remember 2010, spread the paperwork across desks as though deciphering ancient scripture. There were photographs of the victims' smiling faces, brittle interview transcripts scrawled with shorthand notes, and bags of evidence sealed under layers of tape. What had once been routine, almost forgotten, now glowed with urgency. Witnesses who had long since moved on with their lives were recontacted. For some, the call stirred deep unease, dragging them back to the spring of 2010, when their community first learned fear could take root so close to home. An elderly neighbor was asked to revisit what she had seen from her porch that night, her memory hesitant, but sharper than investigators expected. Former friends of the victims were interviewed again, this time with fresh technology to test their recollections against timelines reconstructed through digital archives. The families, who had endured decades of grief turned into ritual, found themselves thrust into the glare of renewed attention. For years they had spoken only to one another on anniversaries and at vigils that dwindled in size. Now reporters stood at their doors, microphones extended, questions sharp and insistent. Some family members welcomed the attention, believing it finally validated their cries that the system had failed them. Others recoiled, protective of scars that had barely begun to heal. Baker Street, once a quiet backdrop to an old unsolved mystery, became a media stage. Satellite vans clogged curbsides. Camera crews camped outside the grocery where locals whispered theories. Journalists interviewed teachers, store clerks, and childhood friends, pulling every fragment of memory into the public arena. On social media, the case trended nationally, hashtags reviving an old tragedy into the currency of modern discourse. Inside the Cleveland Police Department, tensions simmered. Younger officers viewed the reopening as a chance for redemption, proof that persistence and science could correct the failings of their predecessors. Veterans, however, bristled at the scrutiny, their past missteps laid bare for a new generation to dissect. Press conferences were carefully orchestrated, officials speaking with measured optimism, but guarding details that might compromise the fragile momentum. In court, prosecutors began the grueling process of preparing for charges that might soon be filed. Legal teams reviewed whether old evidence, degraded by time, could withstand cross-examination. Could a jury, decades removed from the crime, be convinced beyond reasonable doubt? Every decision felt precarious, balanced between hope and the risk of collapse. For the community, the frenzy was disorienting. Shops and cafes that had once whispered rumors now buzzed with reporters asking for quotes. Old fears resurfaced, mingling with new anxieties. The reopening of the case had returned Cleveland to the edge of suspense. Not yet closure, but no longer silence. The tragedy of Baker Street was no longer a story fading into history. It was alive again, pulsing through headlines, courtrooms, and kitchen table conversations. And this time, the city vowed it would not be allowed to slip back into the shadows. The announcement came not with a whisper, but with the full force of a televised press conference. Rows of reporters filled the Cleveland Municipal Building, microphones thrust forward, camera lights glaring. After weeks of speculation, the district attorney's office promised a name, and the city braced itself. When the words were spoken, they seemed to hang in the air as though no one quite believed them. The suspect, the person authorities now accused of ending 2 young lives and burying a community in decades of grief, was not the shadowy figure imagined in rumor. It was not a stranger from out of town, nor a violent drifter. It was someone known, someone trusted. The man in custody had been a fixture of the neighborhood, a volunteer at church, a reliable presence at local fundraisers, even a friendly participant in the very search parties that had combed through wooded trails in 2010. His name had appeared briefly in early reports, but had never drawn serious suspicion. To the outside eye, he was steady, respectable, safe. The reveal struck like a blow to the chest. Baker Street residents who had once borrowed sugar from his kitchen or waved at him from their porches now struggled to reconcile memory with accusation. Parents who had let their children play near his yard sat frozen in front of their televisions, horror dawning with every detail. For the families of the victims, the betrayal ran even deeper. They recalled how he had attended vigils, clasped their hands, whispered words of consolation. To learn that behind those sympathetic eyes might have lurked the guilt of a killer was almost unbearable. "He cried with us," one relative said in disbelief, her voice breaking. "He stood beside us while we mourned." The city, once galvanized by cautious optimism, splintered under the weight of revelation. Some insisted the evidence must be mistaken, that a man so familiar could not possibly have committed something so monstrous. Others turned swiftly, recalling uneasy moments, a too long glance, a strange remark, that now seemed laden with sinister meaning. Local media exploded. Headlines screamed betrayal. Cable news crews amplified the shock nationwide, painting Cleveland as the town that had unknowingly sheltered a murderer for 15 years. Social media turned rabid, with neighbors' memories dissected in real time, every old photograph reanalyzed for hidden clues. The suspect's home became the new epicenter of spectacle. Police tape cordoned off the yard as investigators carried out boxes of potential evidence. Crowds gathered outside, shouting, some in anger, others simply drawn to witness history. Children whispered his name in hushed tones, the way one might speak of a ghost. Trust, that invisible thread binding communities together, frayed almost instantly. If someone so close, so ordinary, could be guilty, then who else might wear a mask? Friends eyed each other differently. Conversations curdled with suspicion. The sense of safety that had begun to return evaporated in an instant, replaced by raw unease. The revelation was more than an arrest. It was a rupture. It forced Cleveland to look inward and confront the uncomfortable truth that evil had not arrived from outside, but had lived quietly among them, shaking their hands, attending their barbecues, standing in line at the corner store. For decades, the absence of answers had haunted the town. Now, with the suspect named, a new haunting took its place, the sickening realization that the darkness had always been nearer than anyone dared imagine. The arrest itself unfolded with a chilling mix of routine and drama. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as police cars rolled quietly onto Baker Street. Officers moved with deliberate precision, surrounding the modest home that now carried the stench of infamy. When the suspect stepped outside, still dressed in a cardigan and slacks, the image stunned those who had known him for decades. His face betrayed little, not fear, not anger, just an unreadable blankness. The man who had once shared tea with parishioners was led away in handcuffs. Inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere turned heavier. Detectives laid out evidence. DNA lifted from clothing, re-examined fingerprints, a witness statement once dismissed but now corroborated. The suspect denied, at first calmly, then with flashes of indignation. He called the accusations absurd, a conspiracy, yet as the hours wore on, cracks began to show. His answers drifted, contradictions piled up, silences stretched longer. Still, no full confession emerged. The trial that followed became one of the most closely watched in London. Journalists packed the gallery, while families of the victims sat quietly in the front rows, clutching each other's hands. The prosecution opened with a methodical reconstruction of 1992, the final hours, the disappearance, the years of silence. Their case revolved around the forensic breakthrough, DNA that, thanks to advances undreamed of in the early 90s, now tied the suspect irrevocably to the crime scene. The defense countered with ferocity. They attacked the chain of custody, raising doubts about evidence preserved for decades. They suggested contamination, mishandling, even outright bias by police eager to close an old case. They called character witnesses, painting the accused as a pillar of community life, incapable of violence. Some neighbors, torn between disbelief and loyalty, testified to his kindness and generosity. Each day in court was a new wound for the families. Hearing forensic experts describe the recovered traces of violence was like reliving the moment of loss. They watched the defense dismantle their loved ones' final hours into legal arguments and technicalities. At times, anger bubbled. At other moments, exhaustion settled heavy on their shoulders. The prosecution pressed harder, unveiling not only the DNA, but circumstantial details that had long lain dormant. A timeline that placed the suspect near the victim's last known location, inconsistencies in his early police statements, and, most damning of all, evidence that he had lied about his whereabouts on that fateful night. Slowly, the facade of ordinariness cracked. Spectators leaned forward with every exchange, the courtroom thick with suspense. Would the jury accept the science, or be swayed by the defense's chorus of doubt? For the community, it felt less like a trial and more like a reckoning with the why. Years they had unknowingly lived beside an accused killer. Midway through the proceedings, a bombshell dropped. An old acquaintance of the suspect testified that, shortly after the disappearance, he had confided something unsettling. Not a direct confession, but a drunken remark about a night that would ruin everything if discovered. The words, vague yet chilling, hung over the courtroom like a storm cloud. The defense scrambled, framing the witness as unreliable, his memory corroded by time. Yet the seed of doubt had shifted, not away from the prosecution's case, but toward the accused himself. As closing arguments approached, the tension was palpable. The prosecution urged the jury to see the arc of 30 years, a community searching, a family grieving, a case frozen in time until science finally unlocked its secrets. The passage of time does not erase guilt, the prosecutor declared, voice echoing. It only delays justice. The defense, in contrast, begged the jury to fear error more than inaction. They spoke of the dangers of convicting on old evidence, the possibility of lives ruined by false certainty. Do not let grief blind you, they pleaded. The jury retired. Hours stretched into days. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, some holding signs demanding justice, others demanding fairness. Inside, the families braced for a verdict that would either bring long-awaited closure or reopen wounds once more. The confrontation had moved beyond the courtroom. It was no longer just about one man's guilt or innocence, but about whether a justice system delayed could still deliver truth without compromise. And as the jury foreperson prepared to read their decision, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. When the jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces gave little away. The foreperson stood, voice steady but edged with gravity. We find the defendant not guilty. The words landed like a gavel strike, echoing not just through the chamber, but through decades of waiting. The family's reaction was immediate and unrestrained. Tears, quiet sobs, and clasped hands told a story of grief carried too long. They had lived in limbo for 30 years, caught between hope and despair. Now, at last, a line had been drawn in history. Yet even in victory, pain threaded through their relief. No sentence, no matter how severe, could restore what had been stolen. The judge spoke at length about betrayal, of trust, of community, of humanity. He described the crime as a wound inflicted not only upon one family, but upon the very fabric of Baker Street, where people had walked for years unaware of the darkness lurking beside them. The court was silent as he handed down the sentence, life imprisonment, with a minimum term that ensured the accused would never again walk freely through London streets. Outside, reporters swarmed, their microphones thrust forward as cameras captured raw emotion. Some in the community expressed gratitude that justice had prevailed. Others voiced the sorrow that such evil had grown quietly in their midst. For many, the verdict was less about punishment and more about reclaiming dignity for the victim, ensuring their story would not end in silence. In the weeks that followed, a vigil was held once more on Baker Street, this time not in desperation, but in remembrance. Candles lit the pavement, their glow reflected in the windows of cafes and flats where people had whispered theories for decades. Now, those whispers had given way to something firmer: truth. Still, closure was complicated. The family spoke openly about scars that would never fully heal. Birthdays and anniversaries remained empty chairs at the table, yet they also spoke of gratitude. Gratitude for those who had refused to give up, for the journalists and investigators who breathed new life into the cold case, for neighbors who stood with them when the world had moved on. The case became more than a headline. It became a reminder of endurance. That justice, though delayed, could still prevail. That silence could be broken, and that communities, even when fractured, could knit themselves together again in shared memory and resilience. On Baker Street, life eventually resumed its rhythm. Tourists still flocked to the Sherlock Holmes Museum. Buses still rolled by in their endless procession. Yet for those who had lived the story, the street would never look quite the same. Beneath its cobblestones lay the memory of a crime once hidden, and the triumph of a truth that refused to stay buried. Closure had come, not perfect, not whole, but real. The Baker Street case was not just the story of a single victim, nor even a single family's decades of suffering. It was also a window into the broader failures and quiet strengths of a system meant to protect. In the early 1990s, London policing was stretched thin, caught between rising crime rates and bureaucratic inertia. Resources were limited, technology lagged behind, and cases like this one, without immediate leads or visible urgency, too easily slipped into the shadows. The tragedy revealed how vulnerable justice could be to delay, oversight, and indifference. Yet it also underscored another truth: persistence matters. Families who refuse to be silent, journalists who refuse to stop writing, and communities who continue to remember. These are forces as powerful as any police file or forensic test. The Baker Street family became a symbol of this persistence. Year after year, they marked anniversaries, gave interviews, and kept their loved one's name alive. Their refusal to let the case fade became its own form of evidence, a pressure that refused to let the system rest. There is also a lesson in humility for law enforcement. In the 1990s, crucial CCTV footage was missed, statements were lost, and early leads mishandled. Those missteps, small at the time, grew into decades of silence. But the eventual reopening of the case demonstrated how institutions can learn, and how technology has transformed the pursuit of justice. DNA databases, digital records, and forensic reanalysis gave investigators tools their predecessors could only dream of. It is a reminder that the passage of time does not only erode, it can also reveal. For the community, the case became a lesson in collective memory. Baker Street is famous worldwide, but fame does not shield a neighborhood from darkness. Locals learned how quickly rumor can corrode trust, how suspicion can fracture friendships, and how unresolved tragedy can hang over a place like fog. And yet, when the truth finally emerged, there was also collective healing. The same street that once echoed with fear now became a place of remembrance, its story folded into the wider fabric of London's history. On a larger scale, the Baker Street case highlights the importance of investing in cold case units. For every breakthrough celebrated, there are hundreds of families still waiting. Advances in forensic science mean that justice is possible in ways once thought unattainable. But without the will to pursue these cases, technology alone is powerless. This case, solved after 30 years, is proof that it is never too late, but also a warning that justice delayed is, for too long, justice denied. Perhaps the most profound lesson is that stories matter. For years, the victim's name risked becoming just another line in an unsolved ledger, but stories kept them alive, in news articles, in family interviews, in whispers along Baker Street. And when the case was solved, It was not only an act of justice, but so an act of restoration, restoring dignity to the victim, restoring faith to a community, restoring meaning to decades of grief. The Baker Street murder reminds us that history is never sealed. Secrets may linger beneath the surface of even the most familiar places, waiting for the moment when persistence, memory, and science finally converge. And when they do, they leave us with a message both sobering and hopeful. That truth has a way of surfacing, even after decades in the dark. Baker Street has long been a name synonymous with clever deduction and fictional justice. Tourists come to see the home of Sherlock Holmes, the detective who never failed to find the truth. But this case reminds us that real life is far more fragile, far more human, and far more painful. It took not a single genius, but decades of persistence, evolving technology, and the unyielding love of a grieving family to bring justice to light. For 30 years, silence threatened to bury the truth. Yet the truth endured. It surfaced not through legend, but through ordinary people who refused to give up. And in that, perhaps, lies the real lesson of Baker Street, that justice, however delayed, is never truly lost if memory is kept alive. As we close this chapter, let us honor the victim not only by remembering their name, but by committing ourselves to the idea that no life should be forgotten, no crime ignored, and no family left without answers. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of London's most haunting cold cases. If this story moved you, if you believe in uncovering hidden truths and seeking justice for those who can no longer speak for themselves, we invite you to stay with us. Subscribe, share, and join us for future investigations, because stories like this deserve to be told and justice deserves to be remembered.